one of the founding partners at Filament Group, and we do front-end code and design, and we really focus on progressive enhancement and responsive web design because we really want to make a web that works for everyone. And I had a really great opportunity when I was preparing this talk. I've done it a couple of times, but it happens that this week is the 4th anniversary of the launch of our very first responsive site, and that was the Boston Globe site. Some of you, it actually was kind of famous when it came out. We were lucky enough to be on this very early project that was kind of the first large-scale project that we saw, at least in the States, that was using responsive design. And it really sort of set a new standard and invented a lot of ideas. And in the time since then, in the past 4 years, we've actually worked on about 35 separate responsive sites, news sites, some e-commerce sites, financial data, custom sites for medical data, classified ads. This is a calendar site for hospitality industry. We also worked, while we were doing all of the things in parallel, on the jQuery mobile framework. So we've done a lot of responsive projects. We probably worked with about 18 or 20 separate teams. And one of the biggest challenges that we've been found all the way through that process is how to figure out how to create a design system and then communicate it so clients can understand and own and extend it. We usually work in small part. We will do like a couple of templates, sometimes 10 or 15, sometimes as many as 60 or 80. And one of the things that we know that like designers and developers, the people in this room, we know that we have to transform the way we work to get responsive to work. But one of the things that we found that's even harder is helping the rest of the organization transform. Your business owners, brand owners, and especially QA teams. This is a really different way to work and a different model of thinking of how you can collaborate. And one of the biggest challenges from the start is always that common design resources that people come with, logos and color palettes and grids and specifications, they really don't work for responsive universe. You know, your 12-column grid has been like the standard since print was started. Things like these kinds of specifications with very, very specific pixel density. When we come to a project and someone hands something like this to us, we know we're going to have to really think differently about how we are going to approach a project for it to be successful. So things like Pattern Lab and these Bootstrap tools, things like these are great, but they don't give you enough. They give you tiny little elements, but not enough to get your head around how the real design system works. So what we have been seeing with a lot of those tools and a lot of those resources is that a lot of these stakeholders, especially brand managers and business owners, think that devices are uniform and predictable, and so they think just coming up with a grid and a set of buttons and form elements is going to be enough. And I think one of the reasons that's true is that, from 2007 to 2014, this was most people's perception of what mobile meant. And this feels like a pretty manageable universe. Even like last year when the device universe extended for Apple, it still feels like something that you can really manage. And so people think they can set a couple of breakpoints, get their design in place, and they can move forward. But one of the things that we like to start with is a reality check. This is Samsung's 2014 device universe. This is what the Android universes looked like in 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015. And so when we're looking at how our responsive design system, this is the kind of universe that we want to help our brand owners and our business owners especially understand that is their challenge. And then there's all the rest of this. The Internet of Things is also coming upon us. There's a lot of diversity there as well. So we want to make sure that all of these pieces are in play for us. This is actually about half of our device lab. We have about 120 devices of various sorts. And I think it's one of those things that helps us understand like a little bit of the broader context, and we try to encourage our clients to make sure they have real devices and some of that sort of outlying devices so that they can get their heads around what real experiences are like. But the real problem is that specifications like this just don't work for that kind of universe. A grid system for this universe is just not going to be functional. And what's at stake? We like to start by saying, so 2/3 of people on mobile sites, they want a mobile-friendly site. And if they find one, they're more likely to buy a site's product or service. Fully half of people that say that if the site doesn't work well, not that if it's just mobile, but if it doesn't work well, they think the company doesn't care about them, and they will leave. So we try to come up with a set of design tools that are a little bit more flexible and techniques to implement them that will work for a responsive universe. So, and one of the things that we want to start with before we even get to that is a new mental model to help everyone understand what we're working toward so that we're all really efficient and work well together. So we always start by just talking about, like, what do we mean when we're talking about design consistency if the 12-column grid in that specification isn't going to work? And I like to start with one of my design heroes. For anyone who doesn't know this, that's Charles and Ray Eames, and they're most famous for the furniture design they did for Herman Miller in the 40s and 50s, but they were also architects, and they were big design thinkers. And they defined design as a plan for arranging elements to accomplish a particular purpose. And even more so, Charles went on to say that the keys to effective design are the ability of designer to recognize as many constraints as possible and then to work well within them, to really embrace them. So design consistency for the responsive web isn't about pixels, it's really about understanding purpose and being willing and enthusiastic to embrace constraints. So this isn't our challenge, this is our opportunity. And this is as well. And then there's a lot of intangibles that we also need to be factoring in. All of them simultaneously, our screen sizes, all of the interaction and input methods, bandwidth, network speed. And one of the things that I think was a really telling moment for us that helped us understand how this challenge really needed to work for us was on the first day that the Globe launched. Somebody tweeted that photo. Actually, they didn't tweet it, they put it up on Flickr. A developer, Grant Hutchinson, actually opened the site on a hacked browser on a 13-year-old Newton. And this is a really interesting moment for us because we didn't see this first, our client saw it, their brand team saw it, and this page was an utter failure of the design system, of the specification, but it was a huge win for the brand. The news was there, everything that was functional worked. And we had taken a really specific approach around embracing flexibility and embracing progressive enhancement especially, and that was an immediate win. 2 years later, again, we don't know who to attribute this to. This was posted on Flickr as well. Somebody had a very early beta of Google Glass and was going around and looking at websites and was just posting images online. And one of the things that the Globe found, based on these pictures and then getting access to a device, was they didn't have to make any adjustments because we had just sort of embraced the flexibility and fluidity of the system. So the thing that lesson taught us was that responsive design needs to support a full spectrum of experiences, even the ones that haven't been invented yet. And to do that, we needed a mental model that accommodates the complexity of the responsive world. And that brought us to this man. For anyone who doesn't know him, this is Abraham Maslow. He has nothing to do with the design, he's a psychologist. And he came up with this theory of sort of human self-actualization in the 50s. But his basic idea was that you only can achieve great heights when you have a strong foundation to work on. So great achievements is possible with a stable foundation. When we started talking to clients on most of our responsive projects, they came to us with a very specific set of expectations about what they needed to care about for their responsive system. They wanted to care about scale, they knew they needed to think about grids and breakpoints, and they wanted to care about style. But in the 36 projects that we've worked on, we've come to determine that there's really two major foundational elements that you have to get right before you can even start thinking about those. First one is speed and performance, and the second one is access and accessibility. So for the rest of the half hour that I have left, I'm just going to go through some of the tools that we have started to use with our clients and with our sort of QA teams and with our internal design teams to help us get our heads around how we can think together about getting an effective system together. So responsive, the first thing that everyone needs to understand is it's definitely more than fitting stuff on screens. As of last month, the average web page was more than 2 megabytes of resources and over 100 requests. That's an enormous, enormous average page for most devices to handle. And the truth is that global network speeds vary very widely, and most of the people we work with, most of the people in this room, have the most advanced and the most forgiving setups. But what really happens is that people assume 4G networks, great devices. That's not the true case for most users out in the world. And at best, it's the most ambitious case. The truth is that more people access Facebook on 2G than 4G. And there's been a lot of interesting research about people's expectations about speed. This is actually a fairly old research report that Microsoft did, but they determined that online shoppers want to see a page in 2 seconds or fewer, and if it doesn't show up in 2 seconds, they'll abandon the site. And they also did quite a bit of research about differentiation. People will make a brand decision to change a site based on a quarter of a second speed differential. Oh, and I should just say I'll tweet these slides. All of these are linked so you can get to their research. So you can take notes if you want, but I'll tweet these as soon as I finish the talk. But I think these kinds of data are the things that have really been transforming our discussions with our clients. So Facebook, lots of people have been publishing research about the change in direct impact that they see when they improve performance and speed. So Google said half a second will impact 25% fewer searches with a half a second increase in page load speed. This I thought was really interesting. GQ I think 2 months ago, they did a redesign that did nothing visual of the redesign. They just enhanced performance of their pages so that they went from 7-second page load to under 2 seconds. And they saw their number of visitors almost double and the time on site go up by 30%. So these numbers are real and compelling, and I think if you're thinking about the effectiveness of your site, performance really needs to be an absolute baseline. For anyone who doesn't know about it, your best friend for these discussions is web page test. You can open any site and you can put it on, they're real devices on real networks, and you can test the speed of your page. And so what we typically do when we're assessing any of our sites is start by saying, if 2 seconds is our user goal, let's see how close we are to that benchmark. So the Apple Store, this is probably a fairly old image, but on mobile devices, they can take up to 8 seconds for anything to load at all. New York Times, something shows up at around 4 seconds, but the full page actually doesn't show up for 29. So third-party tools are actually pretty challenging for that. The list goes on. Lots of people's desktop sites come in at 2 seconds, but mobile we've found is typically 2 to 3 times slower. And so you really need to be thinking about how you're optimizing for these more sort of challenging scenarios. So that's one of our first discussion points, is always that factoring in speed and performance is critical, and these are design choices. So everything about your file size and page speed is something that you make a design choice about. And every time we think about a design element, we're going to put it through that filter of the performance impact that it'll have. So making speed is part of the design process. We try to set performance goals in the design spec. And there are lots of ways that these impact. Images, video, audio, custom fonts always have impact. Third-party tools are really, really important to consider. Code frameworks, we like to look at things like, that's why when we talk about things like grids and things like that, you want to have the most lightweight, the least amount of non-useful information in any part of your page. And this is something that designers and business owners and brand owners really need to think about. So for every element on the page, we start by saying, is it necessary? Is it necessary for everyone? And is it necessary immediately? So we want to make sure we're doing tests to only deliver resources based on capabilities tests, or make sure that we're lazy loading things that are less essential. And we just want to take a critical eye to everything and make sure that we pare it down to the most essential and then optimize. And there are a lot of techniques you can use to manage perceived performance. So as long as you're getting something to the top of the page quickly, you can let the rest of the page load slowly. We actually do a lot of research on this, and we actually do a lot of open source. We write a lot about our techniques, and everything we put out there is open source and available for use. So if you're interested, we have some really neat techniques for first page load. And also for anyone who's not familiar, my colleague Scott Gell wrote a book this year called Responsible Responsive Design that is a really great primer on some of the important principles for that. And then I know you always hear the responsive images group, like there's whole conferences around how to optimize images, that it's definitely worth looking at that specifically and looking at techniques. I know Sarah talked about SVGs as well. There's a lot of ways to think about optimizing images as well, because they're probably the single largest issue for page size. So that gets us to access. We very, very frequently talk to clients, and they'll come at us asking which device targeting and negotiation tools we use and what JavaScript frameworks we look at. And our answer is mostly that we want to make sure that we avoid this, either the 8 to 20 seconds of blank screen or nothing loading at all, because we really think there's just no good reason to prevent people from getting your basic content. And we hear a lot, especially from development teams, that no one disables JavaScript, that it's, it's a real edge case. But we've been seeing some research coming out that we've been finding really interesting. So the Pew Research is a US government agency, and they've been testing people's internet behavior, and they found that 15% of their statistically interesting sample group did not have JavaScript-enabled devices. So it's a real audience, and those are the people who don't have them enabled. There's still the rest of people where it doesn't fire properly, it doesn't load completely. So it's a real concern. So we want to make sure that all of the basic access gets in, and that's why we're huge fans of progressive enhancement. It ensures broad access, and it's very fault tolerant. And for anyone who doesn't know what that means, the simple definition is that we start with semantic markup, we add features based on capabilities, and we make sure that when we add those features with JavaScript that we build in accessibility so that they still work on all devices. We hear a lot that it's an all or nothing, or it's sort of a lowest common denominator solution, but we have found that you can do almost anything that a JavaScript framework can work on with progressive enhancement if you just think differently about your content, your source order, your structure, and your interaction. And so it can be simple to complex examples. So this one right here, the example on the left is no JavaScript, the one on the right has it. And this is just a filtering mechanism. What we do is we just make sure you start with, if you have a select menu, make sure that you have a submit button for it, and then when you use JavaScript to do the unblur, then you hide it. But make sure that if the JavaScript fails, you still allow someone to take care of that basic functionality. Things like visual feedback, beautiful, but basing them on standard components and standard elements is just sort of a friendly way to do it. And we've actually seen that we can take this to pretty extreme cases. These sliders are actually, they're obviously JavaScript, but they're just based on common select elements. So just layering the JavaScript features on the standard elements that sit behind them, and making sure that all of the submits and things like that are all tied together to that same basic, the basic foundation, gives you a lot of freedom to do some really interesting JavaScript tools, but making sure that someone who's got a terrible phone or is on the tube and loses signal can still perform a task. Again, conditional errors, visual feedback, things like that. We still want to make sure that someone can fill out a form and submit it. So for the key to access for these is we want to make sure that core content, our words and images, are available, that essential functions work, that we enhance without blocking any of those capabilities, and that we think about accessibility and fallbacks. We make sure that we put in our roles, make sure that we consider all that. And one of the most crucial aspects of this is to involve the QA teams in the design process so that they understand that there will be expected variations and that we are accommodating them. We have developed lots of little progressive enhancement-based widgets. They're all on our website. They're open source, and people are welcome to use them. And for anyone who is interested in the topic, we've got 400 pages of nerdery around progressive enhancement that gets into the details about how to think about actually creating your own components. But one of the things that we say is, contrary to some popular belief, progressive enhancement really liberates us to focus on great design opportunities. And that gets us to scale. So first conversation every single time when we walk into the room is like, what are our breakpoints? Okay, we're going to do 320, 768, and 1024, right? And actually, for static designs, we actually say most of the time, yeah, we do kind of want to know where we're all going, and we want to set direction. So we still do, I know there's a lot of talk about designing in the browser, and we try to get to the browser as quickly as possible, but we still do designs, static designs usually. We work in Illustrator because it's vector and we like that, but any tool that gets you to a common understanding of the visual style is great. One of the things that we like to do is we think about components, we think about scale, things like that. But what we have found is that once you get into site production, those breakpoints are frequently irrelevant. And one of the most important things, especially with the proliferation of new devices, is that the space between 350 and 750 is just super challenging and really neglected, and you can't sort of set those breakpoints super intuitively. So we've started to get to an approach where when we're thinking about page layouts, we really want to think about the simplest possible math for those. So just for the overall page framework so that all the pages feel like they come from the same system, we'll come up with a set of templates that have maybe 1 or 2 breakpoints. They're just general ideas for stacked modules, sometimes columns. And they're really simple. Sometimes we'll put fixed size columns next to flexible ones. Again, these pages look like they have lots of texture and complexity, but they share 2 common breakpoints for a set of 80 templates. Same thing again, so this is a kind of math that you can sort of collectively get your heads around, and it becomes a really useful tool for people to work together and come up with some consistency, but not be locked down to too much checking with each other all the time. So we keep the breakpoint logic simple for the templates, and then we focus most of our complexity in components. And that's a richer opportunity to micro-optimize. So we'll do things like traditional design best practices definitely are our guide for this. You know, fluid doesn't equal responsive. We want to make sure that we have comfortable line lengths. So short for scanning, longer for immersive reading. We want to make sure, and that's how those sort of play out. Make sure that hit rates for interactive things are comfortable. Apple says 44 pixels is a minimum. I think Google says 50, but those are just like really basic guidelines for how we sort of communicate how we're going to manage things. And then for really complex data and functionality, we do a little extra. So mastheads are always an interesting challenge and an interesting opportunity because there's a lot of richness in them. So for some sites, we'll do 4. Sometimes we'll do 6, 8, even 10 variations. Tabular data is also a really interesting challenge. We want to make sure that we optimize so people can see the grouped information that they want to be able to scan and look at side by side. So those are areas where we want to do some little micro-optimizations on typography, on how elements relate to each other. And then we've actually done cases where this is a site that we did that had a calendar element in it. This has the same underlying markup, but we knew that people had different mental models for how they thought about how they wanted to see data and information density. So we took that same content and styled it very, very differently from desktop to tablet to make sure that we were taking advantage of information density so people could scan quickly and get the information they needed. And then we do a lot of work with taking components and using them across the breakpoint spectrum and layering things over each other. So we have a filter bar in the right-hand column on desktop sizes. We take that exact same filter bar and just drop it into an overlay menu. So there's a familiarity when you go from one device to another. Things feel like they're consistent. And it's actually much easier to implement from the dev side as well. Same thing with tabular data, again, is always an interesting challenge. So we've got these ideas where you sort of isolate and identify the most important data, make sure that that's shown, and then collapse the secondary information into collapsible panels, things like that. This is kind of an interesting tool for anyone who has tabular data challenges. We actually came up with a plugin called TableSaw that actually lets you take an HTML table, class columns of data so you can identify their priority, and then it automatically scales the page. And for any column that isn't shown, it'll actually drop it into a menu and gives the user control over whether or not they want to use. So they can check data on and off at smaller sizes. So it's a nice sort of option for users to have control, but also to sort of manage the size and scale of the page. And then for the other thing that we talk a lot about with clients is sort of how decision-making works. So for very small screens, we want to give people enough information to make the first decision that they need. And so we do a lot of layering in that way. When you have more screens, seeing examples isn't quite as overwhelming. So we want to sort of be decisive about how to give people the information they need to be thoughtful. So the scale takeaways are definitely simple page grids and the breakpoints and components that take more complexity. Really simple best practice typography and hit space and interaction size of things, and then proximity and density for good decision making, especially for like web apps and things that have some complexity. So that gets us to style. And the interesting thing about style, it's something that people get really worked up about on responsive, and it actually is sort of the least controversial in some ways. Your logos, your color palettes, distinctive shapes and textures, those all generally work everywhere. So those are things that we apply pretty simply. You know, scaling a logo is something that brands have been doing forever, and we follow the same basic principles. But there are a couple of things that we do typically talk about. Again, this is where the whole performance question comes into play. A little time check. Oh, good. All right. So one of the things that we've seen a lot is there's lots of people are really embracing custom fonts. But what we found is that each custom font can add a quarter to half a second on a 4G connection, but up to 2 seconds to load for a slower connection. So if you have 3 or 4 custom fonts, and that's each face. So if you have a bold, an italic, a Roman, that's like a 1/4 second to a 1.5 seconds for each one of those as you load. So as we look at custom fonts, we really want to talk about like what you gain for the potential impact of adding up to 10 seconds for three fonts. And that's a case where we'll try to be really, really decisive about that, or think about lazy loading so that your first screen load uses default fonts and then you load them in the back so that the second screen shows up. So try to be really discriminating about that. Things like rounded corners and gradients and things like that, we have sort of tried to move all of our clients to thinking about CSS for all of those capabilities. And one of the things that we found is that older browsers, especially IE, doesn't support those. So we've had some really interesting conversations to say, is it worth 2 to 10 seconds for every single one of your users so that someone who's on IE6 can get a rounded corner and a gradient on their button? And the answer to that is usually no. So we sort of are selective again about how we apply these capabilities, and this is a point where we would document for the QA team that for certain browsers you're going to have a slightly different experience. So it really becomes a challenge or an opportunity to communicate that there is sort of a spectrum of experience that we're going to deliver based on device capabilities, and we're going to use those device capabilities as well as we can to get the fastest possible site. And then there are a couple of things that we have seen some really interesting anomalies, and we just advise people to proceed with caution. So icon fonts, fixed positioning, custom form elements, animations, and internal scrolling elements are really tweaking on some devices. I don't know if anybody's seen any examples like this, but if you have an icon font and the device that you're on doesn't recognize it, it will just replace with whatever it thinks is in the Unicode for that space. Lara Hogan works at Etsy, and she does some wonderful presentations, but this was something that happened to them once. They had their rating system, and iOS couldn't find the half star and replaced it with a horse. So they actually have this wonderful, they have T-shirts for 4 horse stars. But this was it was a telling moment where they discovered that icon fonts are not as reliable as they had hoped. Again, and sometimes you'll end up with something like this, right? Where for a while emoji was not supported on Chrome. You know, that's like, if it's essential content, we have found that SVGs or bitmaps are just more reliable, so we tend to rely on them. Fixed positioning is something that we constantly have people saying, we really want to make sure that people see this menu, this opt-in, this download my app. And we say the fixed position almost always works, but not the way you expect. So what we try to do is to limit it, to think really, really carefully about why and where it's important, and to make sure that it is dismissible. So that's the most important thing. If you're going to fix anything, make sure that a user can get rid of it, because it can be on some devices and some browsers. And this was actually probably a year-old version of a common version of Chrome. It wasn't even an odd browser, but it was just implemented poorly. And this is another kind of exercise that we do for our QA teams, and this GIF will be there for you guys so you can show your QA teams. We did a test to see how using CSS only to style select elements worked on pretty much every browser that was contemporary when we did this just about a year ago, and we just took a screenshot. And we talked to the team about whether or not customizing to fix all those anomalies was okay, or was something we wanted to, again, add the bandwidth for, or whether it was okay that some browsers were not going to get that custom CSS styling and they were just going to see a native element. We find that these pictures worth 1,000-word moments are actually super helpful for both our brand owners and design teams, and especially our QA teams, so that they know what they can expect, and they don't knock themselves over the head to try to solve problems that we don't need to solve. We did a lot of work with the jQuery mobile framework, and found that there are certain, especially Android devices, that are really, really terrible with animations, especially when you do things like slide a page over for a menu to open. So we were seeing that they were taking 4 to 8 seconds to open an animation, and it was because the browser was rendering the image so it could prepare to move it, but no one's waiting 4 seconds without something happening. So one of the things we want to do is, again, make sure that we do a device test to make sure that keyframe animations are supported in a certain way, and then only do those animations there. And for everyone else, do a simple transition or fade. Social widgets are heavy. They're necessary. We know they're important. What we just generally advise is lazy load them. Make sure that they don't block your page. We have a widget that we've done called Social Count that is actually a super lightweight widget that will actually poll your counts and display them, and then you can opt into loading the full widget, and that's up on our website for anyone who's interested. But for all of those cases, again, we start by saying, like, are these things necessary? We want to make sure that when we deliver them, we confirm capabilities and apply them carefully. We're going to provide fallbacks and test on real devices for all of them, and then know that there's going to be a spectrum of experience that we're going to support. And then the last point is that for approvals, QA, style guides, everything, the code is the documentation. We have moved to static code repositories for all of our design systems. So we do the sort of the image-based stuff just enough to articulate the principles of the design system, and then immediately move to code and build our systems from there. So instead of trying to manage a grid system or any of those specifications in a static way, we actually build static sites that you can open on all the devices, take a look at them side by side, and then when the production team works, they actually use the exact markup and the exact CSS that we're using. We've actually tried to help our clients transform their sort of business process so that the front-end development team that manages CSS especially is in the design group, so that the CSS is owned by the design team, and they can then maintain the integrity of the design system, and they hand a CSS file to the backend team and to the front-end developers who work with backend integration, and then the collaboration works that way. So the design team really owns style and owns a lot of those interaction behaviors, and that actually has worked pretty well. So yeah, these are our principles that we have been following and that have actually led to some really successful responsive projects. We want to make sure that at every point in the design discussion, we're talking about how do we make it fast and how do we make sure it functions. And then when we get into sort of the visual design aspects, we're looking for simple grids and complex components. We want to use scale and style to the advantage so that user gets to make good decisions and the code becomes documentation. And what it really always comes down to is that consistent doesn't mean that it's identical. Consistent means that the appropriate experience for each device and person is happening. And I think I might be, a little ahead of time. Okay. So.
Do you want to take one question?
Yeah, sure. If anyone has a question. No questions. Yeah.
How important would you say the QA team is?
So we actually, on the project that we've been working on, we try to get a QA team to be a part of the design, at least one representative of the QA team to be in each of the design review sessions and to make sure that they are actually working with the static code and using it side by side with the code that they're developing. So we want to make sure that a member of the QA team is there from the first discussions all the way through. So we try to get like one rep. But it is a really different process for QA teams to sort of think about what they even are testing. So we try to make sure that we're accommodating their concerns as we're doing our design.